Good morning, everyone. Before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on traditional indigenous land, the territories of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm grateful for indigenous teachings about how to be a good steward and care for this place today and for the next 7 generations. And I want to reaffirm the Green Party's commitment to the truth and reconciliation process. Tomorrow is Budget Day, and I want to highlight 2 of the Green Party's priorities, and you can see our other priorities online. First, I am renewing my call to Premier Ford to cancel Highway 413 and not fund this reckless and environmentally destructive project in tomorrow's budget. Instead of wasting $10 billion on a highway that we don't need, the Green Party is calling on the government to use that money to fund a $4 billion 4-year mental health plan and a $5 billion green building retrofit program. I first raised the issue of Highway 413 last July when I opposed the government fast-tracking the environmental assessment process for this project. I have repeatedly questioned the Ford government's insistence to push through this environmentally destructive and fiscally irresponsible highway. And I just want to say how pleased I am to see other parties starting to follow our lead and other levels of government coming out against Highway 413. The only thing this $10 billion highway will accomplish is it will supercharge sprawl, and it will only save commuters 30 seconds while paving over 2,000 acres of prime farmland and parts of the Greenbelt. The Premier needs to get his priorities straight. He needs to put people before land speculators and PC insiders. Ontarians have urgent needs that require decisive and transparent action from the government. The issue facing Ontarians today are not things that people just read about in the papers. They're things that people are experiencing every day in their lives. The mental health crisis in Ontario is real. Levels of depression, anxiety, substance use, suicide, and eating disorders are all rising at an alarming rate. 67% of nurses say they don't have adequate access to mental health supports, and 60% of nurses working in long-term care with large outbreaks have reported experiencing symptoms of PTSD. The suicide rate for young people has tripled. We absolutely must ensure that Ontarians have access to the mental health supports they need, when they need it, where they need it, and in a way that's affordable and accessible. Without funding for a comprehensive mental health plan, we will be facing another public health crisis coming out of COVID, what some experts are calling the impending 4th wave of the pandemic. Tomorrow's budget must make investments needed to help people get through the pandemic, and it must begin to invest in economic recovery that addresses the other crisis that is barreling down on us, the climate crisis. It makes sense to align Ontario's economic recovery with a green recovery that addresses the climate crisis. Climate investments are not just about the future. The impact of the climate crisis is being felt more and more every day. And like with COVID, the most vulnerable will be hit first and worst by climate. We are running out of time. If we don't invest in climate action now, we will pay far more later. A $5 billion green building retrofit program will save people money by saving energy. It will leverage an additional $80 billion in capital investment and create over 800,000 jobs. Climate action is job action. So I'm calling on the Ford government to stop wasting time and money on reckless and irresponsible development projects like Highway 413 and start prioritizing investments in helping people and businesses survive the pandemic and get back to work in a way that addresses the economic and climate crisis. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Your first question comes from Jeff Gray with the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Oh, hi, Mike. I wanted to
Jeff.
ask you a question. I think the budget, the government is going to try and show that it is putting some money into some of the priorities that you've outlined, but they're also going to try and show us that they are tackling the deficit and keeping an eye on spending. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. Is it too early in this mess that the province and the world is in to be worried about the bottom line like that?
Well, first of all, I think what most Ontarians are saying is prioritize the investments we need to get through the pandemic. A safe workplace plan, paid sick days, supports for small businesses, addressing the mental health crisis, making sure our schools are properly funded, providing minimum standards of care and long-term care, and invest in economic recovery. Because the faster we get through the economic crisis, that will begin to generate the revenues we need to address the fiscal hole that the province is in. It makes far more sense, particularly at a time when we are experiencing low interest rates, to make the investments we need to address the public health and economic crisis and recover in a way that addresses the climate crisis. When I did meet with the finance minister directly and put forward our budget ideas, he did ask me the question of, well, what would I do to help save money? And my first response was cancel Highway 413. Nobody wants to waste $10 billion on a reckless, environmentally destructive, and irresponsible project that's only going to save commuters 30 seconds, and invest that money in other priorities like mental health and like a green building retrofit program.
Right, although, of course, as you say, you won't save the money, you'll spend it on other things. But I wanted to ask you about 413. Given the, I think, pretty extraordinary votes against it in suburban municipalities, and even some of the lukewarm comments that members of the government have made, won't you be really surprised to see it in that budget tomorrow? Wouldn't that be a kind of a surprise?
Well, you know what? 6 months ago, this government was fast-tracking the environmental assessment process and making building Highway 413 a top priority. And so I've been really proud of the role that the Green Party has played in leading the charge and generating the opposition to Highway 413. I remember when I held our first press conference last summer, I had a couple mayors say to me, Mike, we're all with you in opposing this, but you're not going to stop this highway. And here we are 6, 7, 8 months later, and the opposition is overwhelming. And my hope is the government is going to listen to the people and to local elected officials, cancel this highway, and use the $10 billion on more urgent priorities.
Your next question comes from Colin DeMello with CTV News. Please go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Schreiner.
Morning,
I
Colin.
find it interesting that the finance minister asked you for tips on saving money. What does that tell you about the priorities going into this budget, if that was one of the questions asked of you during your conversation with him?
Well, Colin, I think one of the challenges that this government hasn't addressed, and I think has made the pandemic worse, is a reluctance to spend money that needed to be spent to help prevent particularly the second wave. when the government was sitting on $12 billion over the summer that could have been invested in long-term care, could have been invested in our schools, could have been invested in increasing our testing and lab capacity to help mitigate the second wave and avoid some of the economic lockdowns we've experienced, just shows you how the government's priorities are just not the priorities of the people of Ontario. And right now, people want the government to make the investments needed to get us through this pandemic and then recover from the economic crisis that it's caused, and do it in a way that addresses the climate crisis.
The finance minister had said, given the choice between cuts or tax increases, he would choose neither in getting the budget deficit down at some point. Is that realistic to rely on neither tax increases nor budget cuts to kind of achieve balance at some point?
Well, I think in tomorrow's budget, the priority needs to be investments. I don't think people are looking in tomorrow's budget for cuts in any way. As a matter of fact, I think people are looking for additional investments. And I don't think people are looking for tax increases right now, especially when we're facing, an economic crisis and a health crisis. I do think moving forward in future years, we're going to have to start having a conversation about how we generate the revenue we need to get back to some sort of fiscal balance while still being able to make, those vital investments in essential public services like healthcare, like mental health, like education. But I think tomorrow's budget really needs to be about making the investments we need. I mean, interest rates are still at historic lows. And so now is the time to make the investments to get us out of the public health crisis, get our economy up and running again, generating government revenues that we can then invest in public services and addressing the fiscal situation.